Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for Trinity College's Margaret MacMillan Lecture in International Relations, tonight by Margaret MacMillan. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which Trinity College and the University of Toronto operate is part of the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and Anishinaabe people covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. We acknowledge the stewardship of this land by First Nations, the continuing presence here of Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and the harm caused by colonialism. We also commit ourselves to a new and an honorable relationship with the First Peoples of this land. Now, since the inception of the Margaret MacMillan Lecture in International Relations, we have been fortunate to host some of the most amazing academics of our time. And of course, tonight is a very special evening for us. I thought I would just say a couple of things about the beginning of this lecture when it first started, because it's kind of interesting considering that we have Margaret MacMillan herself here with us tonight. So the very first lecture was in 2007, and the lecture was made possible through the generous support of the Peter Munk Charitable Foundation, and it's a joint activity of Trinity College and the Munk School of Global Affairs. When the lecture was established in 2007, it was presented fittingly by Margaret MacMillan herself in 2008. And at that time, the lectureship was designed, as the document said, to recognize her tremendous contributions to the study and teaching of international relations and her really critical role in founding one of the college's most innovative programs, the Margaret MacMillan Trinity One program, which of course flourishes today thanks to Margaret's incredible initiative. And this lecture, of course, continues to be a signature moment at Trinity for students, alumni, and friends of the college. Tonight, of course, we're on Zoom instead of in person, but we're really thrilled to be able to welcome Margaret herself back for this lecture. And as I said to her earlier, although we're sorry that we're not able to be in person, she has attracted, no surprise, such an amazing crowd of people that we'd probably have to move to Varsity Stadium were we to host it on site. But we do look forward, of course, to doing that at some time. And I have to say that it is an incredible privilege and an honor to welcome my predecessor back to the college. Following Professor MacMillan's lecture, we will, of course, have time for a short Q&A. And Professor Timothy Sale, Director of Trinity College's International Relations Program, will moderate that. So we encourage you to submit your questions for Professor MacMillan through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And it's now my great pleasure to ask Professor Robert Bothwell if he would do the formal introduction of our speaker. Professor Bothwell.
Thank you very much, Provost. Well, I'm not sure that formal is really going to be the word for it. Margaret is someone that I've known now for 55 years, which may give you a sense of our vintage. Margaret is a graduate of the University of Toronto in the Modern History course, Honors Modern History, in 1966. And unusually for that period, she then headed over to Oxford and took a series of degrees there, culminating in a doctorate. And at that point, she was a scholar of British India. Now, one thing I can say, looking back on our on our lives and on the decades that we went through, Margaret got back to Canada when the going was no longer good. In other words, she was not able to teach in her subject. She was not able to teach at the University of Toronto. She did get a job at Ryerson Polytech, as it then was, later Ryerson University. And that was kind of a baptism of fire. I don't in any way mean to put it down, because what it did do was put the academic on their wits. I mean, it really was rigorous training in lecturing in whatever needed lecturing in. And so that meant that Margaret became a kind of historical polymath. And it's very hard actually for me to think of any area of history that she's not actually capable of lecturing in. So I must say, while we at the U of T sort of ambled along grazing on the green fields of the back campus, Margaret was really out there earning her keep. She then served as chair of the history department at Ryerson. And then in the 1990s, it became clear that there was going to be a vacancy in the provostship. And Margaret was urged by a number of people to let her name stand. It wasn't her idea, it was their idea, and it was a signal of her position and popularity in the college, where she had been teaching, in fact, for a couple of years in various courses. So not to belabor the point, but through some magic process, she was chosen as provost and came into the college just as the 21st century dawned. And what was very clear at that point was that the provostship needed a renovation. In other words, it had fallen out of touch with students, and it needed, in a way, to bring students back to the center of the college. And that, in particular, was what Margaret did in the initial period. But in fact, she was one of the most active provosts in living memory. In fact, it's really hard to think of any provost prior to her who was so energetic and so constructive in the running of the college, at which point she was also teaching for the University of Toronto without pay, I should say. And I hope that set an example. At any rate, Margaret was a very successful teacher here. She was a very successful provost. She is well remembered with affection by the graduates of U of T at that time. Now, I haven't said anything much about her historical work. One thing about Margaret is she isn't afraid of anything. And she has a tendency to tilt at very large windmills, again, very successfully. She chose big topics for her historical work, starting with the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, something that had proved impossible for historians up to that point to write a readable book on. And she not only wrote it readably, but it is regarded, I think, as the standard on that particular great event. And then there have been a whole series since then. Nixon in China. Well, Margaret had lectured on China back at Ryerson. She had a head start, and she wasn't afraid of Henry Kissinger, which most normal people would be. And then she went on to, let me see, 1914. She has done an excellent book, and one that is really relevant to the present time, on the uses and abuses of history. Again, these are areas, big subjects, that most professional historians these days stay away from. Now, let me say something about the character of her work, what you're likely to find. In the first place, she's an exceptionally good writer. And so that guarantees a literate experience. And the nice thing about her work is that it has reached out to all sections of the community and not merely to academics. In fact, I think she'd be horrified if she thought that her book sold only to academics. Well, I can tell you she'd be bankrupt too. And so Margaret has, well, taken large subjects. How does she do it? Well, she focuses on personality. I mean, she's exceptionally good at bringing the past alive and through the characters that she is writing about. And it's through those characters that she conveys the events, the empathy, the identification, the understanding of past eras. So I know that you're going to have a wonderful time tonight listening to Margaret, who'll be talking on her latest book, War, or on subjects derived from that book. And without further ado, I turn it over to my classmate and long-term friend, Margaret MacMillan.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to thank the Provost as well for her very generous remarks. It's a pleasure always to be back at Trinity. I just wish I were there in reality and not virtually. So I can't see you all, but I have many happy memories of Trinity, and it's a place that I'm always delighted to be connected to. And thank you, Bob, if I may call you Bob rather than Professor Bothwell, because I've known you for so long. That was a very kind introduction indeed. I'm going to venture to do a PowerPoint, which may or may not work. If it's not working, I hope someone will let me know. But what I'd like to do is start with the famous Dürer etching of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And these are from left to right: death, famine, war, and plague. And it says something about the nature of history, which is, I'm afraid, a great deal about death, famine, war, and plague. But the one I want to look at particularly is, of course, war. And I think what's also worth noticing in this sketch, in this drawing, is the innocents at the bottom who are being trampled by these great catastrophes. And I think this is something we need to remember when we look at war. Great catastrophes have shaped history for better and worse, and I think we have to always be aware of that. History will chug along quite often in quiet ways. Things sometimes change very slowly over the past, but sometimes they change very quickly indeed. And those sorts of catastrophes that I'm talking about bring about such changes. War is one of them, but so are pandemics, and I think we're knowing at the moment what it's like to live through a pandemic. Environmental change, the mini ice age of the 17th century, has, it's been argued, produced war and famine and social revolution around the globe. Economic crashes will also do that. Now, I'm afraid I've lost my PowerPoint for a minute, so if you'll forgive me, I'm going to try and get it back. I'm not sure it's actually showing up. Sorry, I apologize for this technical. Can you see the PowerPoint? No. Okay. I think I'm gonna. If you don't mind, I'm going to forget about the PowerPoint because it's going to be something of a distraction. What I want to stress particularly while I'm talking to you is the complicated relationship between war and society, because it is a two-way relationship. Different kinds of societies produce different kinds of wars, given the nature of those societies. Wars are fought in different ways by different sorts of societies. I mean, this, in a way, seems obvious. If you have an aristocratic society where those at the top rely on the possession of land and the possession of power in order to keep their social status and their positions, then they will be the ones doing the fighting. They, in fact, don't want those at the bottom of society to learn how to fight, because they might actually get some ideas about what they could do with their power. But war also leaves a deep imprint on societies, and we think of the changes that have happened when great conflicts have engulfed societies, the changes that happened throughout Europe and throughout much of the world as a result of the First World War. Social revolution, I think it's quite possible to argue that without the First World War, the Russian Revolution would not have happened. The Russian state was beginning to reform. Even the last Tsar, Nicholas II, had been forced to concede a constitution, was being forced to accept that change was coming. And the First World War, I think, made it impossible for what was a very creaky regime to carry on. Without the First World War, I think that tiny band of Bolsheviks would not have seized power in Russia in the Second Revolution of 1917. In fact, Russia might have turned out to be a very different sort of state, and we'd be dealing with a very different sort of Russia today. And so that relationship is one that I think has gone on through history, and it's impossible, I think, to say which comes first, war or society. I think organized society and war, unfortunately, for better or worse, have gone hand in hand down through history. It seems, and of course, the further back we go in history, the less likely we are to properly know what happened. But the further back we go in history, it seems that from very early on, from the moment we began to organize ourselves into bands, related by blood perhaps, familial bands, but also larger groupings of tribes who claim some sort of common ancestry or perhaps a common god. Once we began to organize ourselves, we began to mobilize our forces to either defend ourselves from others or to attack others. It simply seems to have been part of human history from almost as far back as we can tell. Our archaeologists have found mass graves around the world dating back many millennia before the birth of Christ, which suggest that those bodies in the mass graves died as a result of trauma. In other words, died in some sort of combat. And this is not something that's confined to any part of the world. We all seem to have been like that everywhere in the world. The history of humanity is one of many different stories, but one of the major themes, the threads that run through the history of humanity is that relationship between war and society. War has left its imprint on our institutions. It's left its imprint on the place names we have. Some of you may come from Waterloo, which, as you probably know, used to be called Berlin until the First World War, until it was decided that Berlin was the wrong sort of name for a good patriotic Canadian city. It's left its imprint on our arts. Some of the great works of arts, like the Dürer, which I showed you in my rather unsuccessful PowerPoint, were produced in reaction to the horrors of war, but we have to accept also that some of the great works of art that have been produced have glorified war. Some of the great monumental columns in Rome, for example, some of the great statues, some of the great arches, these were produced by war. Some of the paintings by David, who was really Napoleon's propagandist, one of the best painters of his time, created endless pictures of Napoleon in triumph. You may have seen the famous one of Napoleon riding a horse across the Alps. The horse is rearing up and Napoleon looks, of course, triumphant. Underneath, if you look closely, the stones that the horse is treading on are the names of Napoleon's predecessors. Hannibal is written there, and they're being trampled under the hooves of Napoleon's horse. In fact, the reality, as is so often the case, was quite different. He rode on a mule in a snowstorm, grumbling the whole way. But the picture shows something of the glory of war, and it is, I think, a very powerful picture. The impact of war, particularly in the modern age, has been to create massive bureaucracies. I think a good deal of the production of modern bureaucracy was when nations had to mobilize themselves for war, because as war became more complex, it demanded more and more of the resources of a state. And to extract those resources, you had to know such things as where your state began and ended. The drawing of boundaries, the drawing of borders in the modern age was partly done by war, but also done for war. To extract the resources of society, you needed to know how many able-bodied men you had to fight. And so censuses, the Romans started it, but they were adopted again in the 18th and 19th centuries. Censuses were done so you could count who could actually fight for you. Citizenship, who was entitled to fight or who you could ask to fight for you, also became important. The beginnings of identifying people by their membership of a particular state has a great deal to do with war. And so the development of so much that we take for granted in our societies has been affected by war. We have, I think, very complicated attitudes to war, especially perhaps those of us who have lived in what is called the long peace. Professor Bothwell and I, and some of you perhaps here tonight of our vintage, will know just how lucky a generation we have been. We came of age just at the end of the Second World War. We lived, it is true, through the Cold War, but the Cold War never turned, at least not for those of us living in the more fortunate parts of the world, it never turned into a hot war. And Canadians, although they had fought in the Korean War as part of the Cold War, were not directly affected by conflict in the way that other parts of the country were, other parts of the world were. And I think this is true for much of the world. And those of us who have enjoyed the long peace, I think, are sometimes unaware of just how present war is and how many other people in the world and how many other parts of the world have suffered from it and how persistent it has been throughout history. Since 1945, there has been, when the Second World War ended, there has been a major war somewhere in the world at any time, any year. And millions of people have been displaced by war, have suffered through war. Millions of people have died in wars since 1945. But it's quite easy to forget about war when it doesn't affect you directly, when it's being fought somewhere else in the world. And I think we perhaps have forgotten to take war seriously. We have begun to assume, and I say we, meaning people like me who live in countries such as Canada, have begun to assume that war is something that doesn't happen to us, that it's a sort of thing that happens to other people, perhaps they're more warlike than us, or it happened in the past. And one of the reasons I think the study of war is very important is because we need to know how wars happen, how wars can affect societies, and we need to be very careful about trying to avoid them, because as Clausewitz, the great Prussian military thinker, said, and others have said, once you start a war, you never know where it's going to go. War is something uncontrollable, and people can talk about limited wars, they can talk about limited objectives, but so often those limited wars turn into something that is much more open-ended, and the objectives will shift and change, and the damage done by that war, both to the enemy but to your own society, will grow and grow. Now, I think perhaps because we've lived in a peaceful world, so many of us, we still have a fascination with war. I mean, if you go into a bookstore, you will see rows and rows of books on war. I live very close to the big Indigo bookstore at Bay and Bloor, and they don't even have a shelf on peace. It's not a subject that people buy books on very much, and there'll be a few books on peace. But if you want to look for books on war, that is one of the largest sections in Indigo, and all sorts of details about war, detailed studies of particular regiments, detailed studies of particular battles. And I think we have, as people have had throughout history, very mixed set of attitudes towards war, even those of us who live in a peaceful world. I think we see war as something that is abhorrent, is dreadful. We understand that it causes tremendous damage, it causes tremendous suffering, but I think we're also fascinated by it. We're fascinated by what I think we often perceive as the glory of war, the nobility of war, the heroism of war. And I think we have to understand our own attitudes, because I'm not sure that we naturally shrink from war. I think there is a dangerous attraction to war. The war movies, the war novels, the histories of war, the ways in which people like to dress up and reenact wars. I think there is a fascination with war, which I think we have to accept. Why it's there, I think, is another question. I'm not sure why we know. But what I think we have to understand is that we do see it as something, not enticing is perhaps the wrong word, but something that does have a sort of glamour. And I think perhaps we ask ourselves, I know I've asked myself this question, could I have done anything like some of the people did in war? Could I have done any of those heroic things that people do? Could I have gone into battle and fought for others? And what I think comes out, and we will never know if we could have done it or not, but it is something I think we often ask ourselves. And what does come out often in the memoirs of war is something which, again, I think is uncomfortable for us to think about, and that is the intensity of feeling. I've talked to people who have fought in wars. I talked to a young man who's now teaching at Oxford who was in the British effort in Afghanistan. And he said, you know, it's very hard to explain, but when you know that you might be dead the next minute, you are living extremely intensely. The colors are brighter, your senses are more alert. He said, you don't do it willingly, but it is something. And he said, you can, in fact, and I think war correspondents and those who fight can sometimes get sort of caught up in that rush of adrenaline. And it comes out in a lot of the war novels and war memoirs. One of the great, I think, novels that came out of the Vietnam War, and perhaps one of the great novels about war of the 20th century, was Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. And he talks there about how life takes on a particular meaning when you know that it might end very suddenly. What also comes out, and I think this perhaps may explain part of our fascination with war, is this sense that you are fighting for a cause that is greater than yourself, and you're fighting with others who will defend you. You have a sort of comradeship, which you very rarely get in civilian life. People in very dangerous occupations, such as firefighters, I think, do have it. But certainly those who have fought in wars say that it's one of the things that they remember if they survive. That does seem to be one of the better things of war. It's one of the reasons, I think, why people join veterans associations and go back. You think they wouldn't want to go back and commemorate dreadful battles, but you do get this sense of a different type of world and a different type of demands on human beings. And so I think we have to accept that our feelings towards war are very, very mixed. What, again, I want to stress is, as far as we know, war has been very much part of human history down through the ages. And again, I mean, we have to ask, what would our world be like? We know how Russia might be different if it hadn't been for the revolution of 1917. What would our world be like, for example, if the United States had taken over Canada, as it thought of doing on various occasions? Or what would our world be like if the United States had remained part of the British Empire? What would our world be like if the United States had divided into two countries in its first civil war? We won't speculate about what might be happening in the next 20 or so years. What would our world be like if the Soviet Union had won the Cold War, or if the Axis powers had won the Second World War? And so I think these are questions which we ask about war. One of the big questions, among others, that we also ask is, why do we do it? And of course, there is a huge debate that goes on about, are we biologically programmed? Has evolution left us with a set of attitudes and a set of impulses and a set of reactions that we don't even perhaps know that we possess, that make us more likely to fight? And there's been a great deal of debate about this. I don't think in any way conclusive, but what people some evolutionary biologists have argued that we have a tendency to want to work in groups. We have a tendency to feel only safe when we're in groups. We also, I've just read a book on why we fight by a young biologist who was also a soldier, who argues that we fight because we want status, that we want status within our group. And one way of gaining status within your group is to show that you are tougher and braver and meaner than anyone else. There are these arguments that go on. Are we really programmed for war? And I would argue, and I'm not a biologist by any means, but I would argue that really I think the jury is still out. I think we can argue that we have a set of impulses. When we're frightened, we tend to lash out. I mean, that we know we have. We fight or flee. I mean, this is something that really seems to be instinctive in us. But I would argue that war is highly organized, that war is not random violence. War is not two people getting into a brawl at a hockey game, for example, or getting into a brawl outside a bar on Queen Street, or people simply clashing with each other and turning rapidly to violence. When you think about war, I think we have to remember just how highly structured and organized it is. I think war is probably one of the most organized of all human activities that there is. You think of the organization that goes into assembling the forces needed for war, to equipping those forces, to moving those forces, to feeding those forces, to making sure those forces are disciplined. And you think of the training, which I'll talk about in a moment, which goes into creating those who will actually fight. I don't think war is something we do naturally. I think war is highly programmed in us, and it is something that we do because we are organized. In fact, there's a very interesting argument by an evolutionary psychologist from Harvard, who's written a book called The Goodness Paradox. And he argues that, in fact, we have probably become rather nicer over the millennia, that just as wolves have been domesticated to turn into dogs, so too have human beings domesticated themselves, so that they've actually become nicer, that they have tended to breed out accidentally those who are more violent. And those who are more violent tend to get rid of themselves anyway, because they tend to get into confrontations that get themselves killed. That also families, parents of daughters, have not wanted their daughters to marry dangerously violent men. And so that therefore the more violent genes in our makeup have been bred out, and we have domesticated ourselves effectively. So we are much more like dogs than wolves these days. What he also argues, this is where Professor Wrangham, I think, is right, what he calls the goodness paradox. As we have become possibly nicer and more peaceable as individuals, we've also become a lot better at war, because we have become more highly organized as societies. We've developed more means of manipulating each other. We've developed more means of turning ourselves into highly efficient killers. And he says that war is something that is intentional, it is directed, it's cold, it's calculating. It may use violence, of course it uses violence, but it uses cold calculation when it's made. And I think increasingly today, with the new types of weapons that are being developed, violence on an individual level is going to be less and less important. It's going to be the person who can be sitting in Arizona and push the button that will kill someone, or a number of people sitting on the other side of the world. It's an interesting debate, and I could go on all night about it, but you'll be glad to know that I won't. But I myself come down on the side that war is something that is produced by culture and by training. And I think we get particular cultures in which those who fight are produced by the very culture itself. I mean, any army, any armed force needs training. I mean, it takes a good many years to turn someone into a proper soldier, a proper airman, a proper seaman. You look at one of the reasons why armies have boot camps, why they have such intensive training, is because they know it takes a good deal of training to make people capable of risking their lives. it runs counter, I think, to another human instinct, and that is to preserve your life. And so that it is important that you overcome that fear and you make people willing to, or simply able to obey orders, even if they don't want to. Frederick the Great always said, I'd like my soldiers to be more afraid of their officers than they are of the enemy. And I think it was right. It took him about 7 years to, he thought, produce a really good soldier. And he wanted people who would obey orders unthinkingly. And so it takes a tremendous amount of training to turn someone, into a person who will fight. But certain cultures will prepare the way for that. And you think of Sparta, where it is said, it may not be true because we don't know about the ancient world, but it is said that when Spartan mothers sent their sons off to war, the sons carried their shields. The most disgraceful thing you could do was lose your shield, because with your shield in the line, and this was true of the Roman legions as well, you were protecting not just yourself, you were protecting the man on the other side. And so to lose your shield was not just to expose yourself to death, but it was in fact to betray the confidence of the comrade you were fighting with. And it was said that Spartan mothers said to their sons, come back with your shield or carried on it. In other words, come back with your shield or come back dead. We don't want to see you any other way. Now, there's been some debate about this, and people say it's not clear that Spartan mothers actually said this, and it may be, they may have been talking about something else. But the sentiment, I think, is a very real one, that you create within those who are going to have to fight an obligation, an understanding, a comradeship, an ability to obey orders, and that often takes a very long time. But in certain societies such as Sparta, the material is already half turned in to those who will fight. And I think you could see the same thing with Prussia, the state around which modern Germany eventually came into existence. Prussia was the most improbable of states. It was a collection of territories that often weren't even in contact with each other. And it was created, it occupied land with very few natural frontiers, some rivers, yes, but no mountains. It wasn't like Italy, for example, or it wasn't like Britain, which was an island. And Prussia was created through war. In fact, the joke about Prussia used to be that Prussia is not a country that has an army, it's an army that happens to have a country. And the Prussian upper classes, the Junker classes, the landed classes, the people who owned the country estates, who often had very long pedigrees indeed, produced generation after generation of young men who thought the noblest thing they could do was go and fight for their king, who were brought up not to fear death, not to fear pain, brought up to be brave. Some of the names that fought for Frederick the Great as officers, fought again in the Napoleonic Wars, and some of them disgraced themselves in the end by fighting for Hitler, but often the same names appeared again and again. And so you have some societies in which the values that inculcate a respect for the military, but also an ability to become part of the military, are very strong. And you could see it certainly in Europe before the First World War, when you got increasing seeping of military values into society. If you look at pictures of school children, particularly on the continent of Europe, but even in Britain before the First World War, just look at what they're wearing. And so often they're wearing what are in effect miniature uniforms. They often drilled in little miniature units. They were brought up to think going into the armed forces was something that was very noble indeed. And so much of the literature before the First World War also inculcated these sorts of values. Even organizations like the Boy Scouts were initially set up to encourage young men to serve king and country and to develop the sorts of military virtues that they were to need if they were to become soldiers. And one of the other interesting questions about war is, you may have noticed I've been talking mainly about young men becoming soldiers and being prepared to fight and being prepared to die and being prepared to kill others. And that is another one of the fascinating questions about war. Why is it so many men? Why is it probably 99.9% of those who have fought down through history have been men? And it is a question which hasn't actually, I think, been engaged in enough. It's a very important question, I think a very interesting one. We know that women can fight. We know that in the past women have fought. It used to be thought that the Amazons, you probably all know the myths of the Amazons, the women who were ferocious, they killed their male infants because they didn't want any men around, they rode on horseback, they were wonderful archers. It used to be thought that this was a sort of myth that the Greeks had invented for themselves to terrify themselves at the prospect of these unnatural women. In fact, recent archaeological excavations around the north shore of the Black Sea have found mass graves, or sometimes with 30 or 40 bodies, but also graves of individual warriors because their arms are around them. And it's now possible, thanks to the ancient DNA decoding, to work out that these skeletons actually belong to women. And so it looks like it wasn't a myth at all, that the Amazons or something resembling the Amazons actually existed. And there was a ferocious, as you probably know, group of women bodyguards of the king of Dahomey in the 18th and 19th centuries who were a byword for their ferocity. One French soldier who fought against them as the French were making inroads into Africa said he had never dealt with such ferocious fighters. And there always have been cases of women who disguised themselves as men and went off and fought quite successfully in the American Civil War, for example, or went to sea. When women have been brought into the armed forces, they have often shown that they can do exactly the same sorts of things that men were doing. In the Second World War, Soviet women volunteered to fight in the Soviet forces, and many of them were in the front lines. They were snipers, they manned artillery battalions, some flew fighter planes, some were bombers. There was a whole group who the Nazis called the Night Witches, and the Nazis hated them with particular ferocity, I think, because it seemed to the Nazis, imbued as they were with their own mad ideology, that women should not be fighting, that it was something unnatural. And they treated any captured Soviet women fighters, combatants, very badly indeed. In fact, I read a memoir by a Soviet woman who said, we always carried 2 bullets. We carried a gun, and we always made sure we had at least 2 bullets in it, one for the German if he was trying to grab us, and a second for ourselves if we felt that we had no hope of escaping. So that the idea that women are naturally more peaceable than men, I think, is one that I'm not sure the historical evidence bears out. And certainly the evidence of the 20th century and now the 21st century, where you have more and more women in combat roles in armed forces, seems to indicate that whatever prevented women from serving in armed forces before, it was not biology so much as it was culture, that it was simply not felt proper for women to be in the armed forces, that it wasn't something they were expected to do and they were not brought up to do. Now, I sometimes get asked, wouldn't the world be a more peaceful place if women ran it? And it's certainly true that women have often taken the lead in peace movements. The peace movements before the First World War had a very high proportion of women in them, as it did in the interwar years. And massive demonstrations, the Greenham Common demonstration, for example, that went on against the deployment of American drones and cruise missiles in the 1980s, was run entirely by women. In fact, they wouldn't allow men to take part in it. So you could argue that women have played sometimes an outsized role in peace movements. On the other side of that, I think we also have to remember that women have sometimes been cheerleaders for war. They have encouraged men to go off to fight, like those Spartan mothers. They have shamed men who have not fought. Here in Toronto, women used to hand out white feathers in the First World War to men of military age who were not in uniform. And they did it in other Commonwealth or Empire countries as well. So to say that women are naturally more peaceable, I think, is not borne out by the evidence. We've certainly got more work to do on it, but I think still we need to look at the cultural factors that determine why people fight and why they don't fight. Another thing I'd like to look at just very briefly is why we fight. If you accept my premise that war is organized, that it's not something that is simply reactive, it's not something that is a simple sudden act of violence, then we need to look at why groups, organized groups, go to war. And I would argue you could pretty much, boil it down is too strong a word, but you can pretty much look at 3 different categories. One is fear. You fight because someone's going to attack you. You fight because you're terrified about what happened. You fight because you have no alternative. In Poland in the Second World War, I think, had no choice but to fight both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany because, as they knew very well, whatever happened was going to be dreadful, but at least if they fought, they would have some choice, some hope of surviving. And I think the Finns felt the same when they took on the enormous Soviet Union in the Winter War of 1939-1940. They felt they had no choice. And so often nations or organized groups will fight out of fear. Sometimes they'll fight a preventive war because they're afraid that someone might be about to attack them. And so I think fear is a highly important motivator. A second motivator, of course, is the other side of the coin. It's you want something that someone else doesn't want to give up. So peoples will fight for greed. They will fight because they see something they want. They want control of resources. I think among the wars we're going to see in the 21st century are going to be wars over water, because I think that's becoming an increasingly important resource and already a source of tension between various countries, between, for example, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt over the waters of the Nile, which are so important, particularly, of course, for Sudan and Egypt. They fight because they would like a piece of territory. They fight because they want loot. They fight because they want treasure. Greed is, as we know, a very important human motivator. And finally, I think the third sort of category I'd look at is that they fight for ideology. They fight for ideas, and I would include religion in that. They fight because they have a vision of a better world, either here on the earth or an afterlife. They fight because there is something greater than them. And I think I'd put nationalism into the same category. Nationalism is a motivating force. When you fight for your nation, you're fighting for something that is greater than you, existed before you, and with any luck will exist after you. Now, often those motives can be mixed. I mean, the Crusaders who went off in the First Crusade, for example, went because they felt they were recovering the Holy Lands for Christianity, but they also went because they thought there were going to be some very rich pickings on the way and once they got to the Holy Lands. And so motives can often be mixed. The fighters of Islamic State will fight because they say they want to spread Islam, they want to restore the Ummah, the united Islamic world, which they claim existed in the 7th century, but they're also fighting because they can get women, they can get money, they can get status. If you look at the descriptions of those people who were unfortunate enough to live under their rule, the fighters for Islamic State, fighters for Al-Qaeda, they all lived well. They lived well, they had better resources, they had the pickings of what they wanted. And so, as so often, I think, our motives are mixed. War also changes. Motives change over time, why people fight change over time, why nations fight change over time. And of course, how wars are fought also changes enormously over time. And this is another of those fascinating sort of intertwined relationships, just as the relationship between war and the organized state is one that I think is very, very important. So is the relationship between war and technology, because what you have available to fight with will help to determine the ways in which you fight. When people fought with bronze weapons, those were not as effective as iron, and so they fought in different ways. When bows became more efficient, people could fight from greater distances. When you made stronger bows, you could fire arrows much further, and so you fought in different ways. The horse, of course, made a huge difference to fighting, which came gradually across from the East into Western Asia and transformed fighting. And for a time, those who were highly mobile on horseback carried all before them, either on horseback or by being drawn in chariots, until people learnt how to deal with them, until foot soldiers learned how to deal with the chariot, with the mounted warrior. And sometimes these lessons had to be learned again and again in different generations. And of course, one of the great innovators in war, and one of the things that changed war a lot, was the invention of gunpowder, that made it possible to send projectiles with great force at the enemy or at enemy fortifications. If any of you have been to Europe and looked at castles from the Middle Ages, you'll notice that they often have very tall and rather beautiful walls. If you look at similar fortifications or castles from, say, the 17th, 18th centuries, the walls are much thicker and much lower, because those very tall and graceful walls began to be knocked down by cannonballs. And so it became impossible to maintain control in your lovely castle with its lovely tall walls. You had to build a very different sort of fortification. What I think we can say about technological changes is that they have been speeding up. And they've been speeding up enormously, particularly in the last 2 centuries, with the scientific and technological and industrial revolutions, which have brought, in many ways, so many benefits. We have also seen the improvement of weapons. Just to give you one example, at the beginning of the 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution was just about to take off, or beginning to take off in certain parts, the average infantry weapon, the musket, could fire at about 100 yards, and it was not that accurate. You had to get very close to the other line before you could fire it, which is why we have the expression, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. And then once you'd fired, of course, you were at a disadvantage because you had to then reload, which could take a number of complicated movements, could often take up to a minute. And so while you were doing this, you were at the mercy of the soldiers from the other side who were marching steadily towards you. By the end of the 19th century, the average infantry rifle could hit a target at 1,000 yards. So you go from 100 yards to 1,000 yards. It could also be loaded lying down. It was much more accurate because it was rifled. And that meant that the very nature of war had to change. Whereas in the Napoleonic Wars, and if you look at the paintings from the period, they march across the battlefields towards each other. By the time of the First World War, they were lying down, they were digging trenches, because if you marched across the battlefield at your enemy, you would be murdered, you would be slaughtered. And that, of course, in fact, is what happened when armies tried to do that. And that pace of technological change, the change also from horsepower to, or just human power, to steam, and then to the internal combustion engine, the development of submarines. War began to expand beneath the surface of the seas, and it went up, of course, into the air. And today it's going into space as well. And so the types of battlefields begin to change. The capacity to inflict damage on the enemy begins to grow. And increasingly what becomes possible is to inflict damage on the civilians on the enemy side. People have always in war attacked civilians on the other side. The French used to have something called the chevoshe, where they would simply march through a countryside, destroying everything, burning villages, killing people, stealing cattle, whatever, as a way of forcing the other side, the feudal lord on the other side of the boundary, or the king on the other side of the boundary, or the duke on the other side of the boundary, to surrender by laying waste to the fields of the enemy and killing the civilians of the enemy. You tried to force the enemy to surrender. But capacity to do that, brutal though it was vastly limited compared to what we have by the 20th century. The capacity, particularly of the long-range bomber, made it possible to destroy enemy cities. The argument always was, if we destroy the enemy capacity to make war, we'll bring the war to an end quicker. The evidence, I think, is still from the Second World War is very much out on that. But the sufferings of civilians, which have always been there in war, in spite of attempts to limit what you can do and not do to civilians, have grown much greater. And the capacity of modern industrial powers to destroy civilian life on the other side has grown enormously. As we know now, the nuclear-powered weapons, the powers that possess nuclear weapons, have the capacity, I think probably, I can say with some confidence, to destroy every living being on the earth, and probably more than once over. And yet nuclear powers are still increasing their arsenals. And so the pace of change has grown very fast indeed. I think often today we see new generations of fighters which are almost obsolete by the time they get into production. The next generation, I was talking to someone the other day in Washington, a fighter pilot. He said they don't need people like me anymore. The next generation of fighters is not going to have pilots, not going to have human beings in them. And this is something which I think is absolutely terrifying. And so we've seen war change as states change, motives of war, I think, remain fairly constant, but how those are expressed will have changed. And we've also seen an increased technological speeding up of technological change and an enormously increased capacity of what we can do in war. The two major developments, I think, in modern war, which really distinguish modern war, the war of the, say, before the beginning of the 19th century from war after the beginning of the 19th century, were what I've already talked about, industrialization. Because what that made possible, and of course, along with industrialization went enormous scientific and technological advances, what industrialization made possible was mass production, urbanization, more and more people moved into cities. It became possible for people's economies to feed, sustain, clothe much larger armed forces. And thanks to the railway, thanks to the steam engine, thanks to the steamship, it became possible to move armies, vast armies, across the face of particularly those countries, of course, which possessed the railways. One of the big advantages, it's always been said, that the American North had in the Civil War was its railway network was simply better than the railway network in the South. Not just that you could move vast armies and their equipment. Just to give you again an idea of the change in the size of armies, Napoleon took an army of probably 800,000 into Russia when he invaded in 1812. It was too big for what he was hoping to do. The Russian countryside, which the Russians themselves had laid waste as they retreated, could not sustain an army of that size. And a lot of Napoleon's soldiers, those that remained in Russia, left their corpses in Russia, died of starvation and illness. They were not killed so much in battle. They died because there was not the capacity to feed them and not the capacity to keep them there. When the Germans mobilized in the First World War in 1914, their armies numbered some 3 million. And this time they were able to feed them, they were able to sustain them. And of course, what the capacity of industrial societies and its capacity to mobilize its resources and capacity to get those resources to those who are fighting meant was that wars could go on much longer. Campaigns were no longer limited by available resources. When the resources ran out, you couldn't carry on the campaign because you couldn't get any more. What now happened, and we saw it in the First World War, it was possible to have a war that went on for 4 years because industrialization had vastly increased the productive capacity of societies and the capacity of societies to get those resources into war and to use them for war. And the second thing I would argue that helped to transform the nature of modern war to make it something that was so enormous and so all-encompassing and could last for so long was the spread of nationalism. The beginnings of peoples defining themselves not as subjects of a particular ruler or members of a particular religion, but peoples increasingly defining themselves as citizens. And I think the American and French revolutions, the spread of liberal ideas had an awful lot to do with this, that people began to see themselves as being part of something called the nation, having a right to choose their own governments, but with the right to choose their own governments came a corresponding obligation to defend that government and to defend the nation. And so nationalism helped to mobilize the emotions and the willingness of those who were going to have to do the fighting. Initially, a lot of the old officer classes were very worried about mass conscription. They didn't want to train a whole lot of people and have them off in the reserves after they'd finished their military training, because they thought if they trained the lower classes would learn how to turn their guns on them. In fact, what happened is that military training, if anything, seems to have made people more patriotic, more willing to fight for their country, more prepared to do so. And so nationalism helped to provide the emotive power that went along with the production of mass armies as a result of industrialization, which is why by the time of the First World War, people had to come up with a new term for what was happening. I think it was a Frenchman who came up with the term total war to try and explain what was happening in the First World War, that it wasn't just the armed forces going off and fighting each other on a battlefield. Now it was one society against another. And we saw that again in the Second World War. And we've seen it again, not always, but we've seen it again since the Second World War. For example, in the war between Iran and Iraq in the 1980s, which I think we don't remember enough, but it was a war on that sort of size, drawing in the resources of its peoples. Sometimes it's been unequal. The Americans fought in Vietnam, I think not in that sort of war. They didn't see it as that sort of war, but the North Vietnamese did. And so I think we still see this capacity of societies to mobilize both the resources and the emotions of their peoples. And I think these are developments which really come out of the 19th century. Well, it sounds odd, but I want to end with perhaps the benefits of war. And this does sound odd when one can think of the horrors of war, but war has also spurred on innovation. It has brought change, often change for the worse. I would argue the Russian Revolution of 1917 was change for the worse, but it sometimes has brought change that I think we would all consider is for the better. And we wouldn't choose as societies to do it in this way, but I think war has helped to bring about changes, sometimes simply confirming trends that are already there, sometimes marking a real disruption with the past. Science and medicine has advanced enormously as a result of war. The hideous wounds caused by gas attacks in the First World War led to terrific advances in reconstructive surgery, in surgeons learning how to deal with dreadful wounds, which has proved beneficial in peacetime. Very near where I live when I'm in Oxford is a plaque on a wall, a blue plaque, which says, "Here penicillin was used for the first time successfully in 1941. Penicillin was discovered in the 1920s. It was too expensive to produce. No one thought it was worth doing. Suddenly a war comes, and as we found when you get a great crisis like COVID as well, suddenly expense doesn't seem all that important when you're looking for a cure. Penicillin was put into mass production. It saved, during the war, hundreds of thousands of lives, and it's gone on to save, of course, I would say millions of lives since the Second World War. Women have played a greater part in modern societies, often as a result of war. The British government passed the Representation of Peoples Act in January 1918, even before the First World War was over, to give the vote to women and to working class men. Women initially only were allowed to vote if they were over 31 because it was felt they were a bit too light and flighty to vote before that. But it did, I think, help to get women the vote and working class men to get the vote because of their contributions to the war effort, because they had done so much to help the war effort. Greater social equality. A number of economic historians, such as Thomas Piketty, have argued that the greatest social equality in Western societies, and that includes Japan as well, was in the aftermath of the First and Second World Wars, because the poles in society were compressed, the rich were taxed more, they couldn't put their money offshore because it was impossible to do so in wartime, and the poor got better wages because it was important to keep them on side during the war, and they got other sorts of benefits. It's said that English children ate better in the poorer parts of Britain during the Second World War than they had done before, because of rationing, because they were actually, for the first time, getting the food that they needed. And so war can bring benefits. As I said, we wouldn't choose to do it in that way. And so I would argue that we need to keep remembering war, not just because I find it fascinating and I do it as an historian, but I think because it is something that has left such a deep imprint on a society. We do remember it, we do mourn those who have died, but as time goes by, of course, I think the memories will necessarily grow weaker, although I've been impressed by the way in which the First World War has seen a sort of reviving of memory. What I think we need to also remember war for is because it hasn't gone away. It has not gone away. I don't think it will go away. We have nations around the world, we have armed groups around the world who are quite prepared to use force to achieve their ends, to force, as Clausewitz said, the enemy, to compel the enemy to do your will. And I think that is still seen very much as a tool to be used by armed groups, whether they are the drug gangs in Colombia, whether they are the forces of Islamic State, or whether they are organized states. And we still, worryingly, I think, have significant states which continue to plan for war and continue, if not to expect war, to assume that it is likely to happen. And one of the things I find very concerning indeed is that in both Beijing and Washington now, you're getting people who are saying not when the war comes with the other, but not if the war comes with the other, but when. And that I find concerning. When you begin to get this level of tension, when you begin to get the plans being made, and when you begin to get what looks like now a developing arms race, the world becomes rather less stable. And so I'll leave you with a thought from that great philosopher, Leon Trotsky, the great Russian revolutionary, who said, "You may not be interested in war, but war will be interested in you." Thank you very much. And I apologize for my hopeless PowerPoint. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much, Professor MacMillan. I think we can all agree that was truly an extraordinary tour through the historical relationship between war and society. Really, really remarkable. You offered us important lessons about how war has shaped our world. And at the end there, certainly raising important questions about how war might shape our future. And some of the questions coming in already are about that. Just before I pose the first questions to you, I want to invite our audience to submit any questions they have through the Q&A function, the button at the bottom of your screen. And we will do our best to get through as many questions as possible this evening. So let us begin with our first question. We live in what seems to be a dangerous world. We read today that great competition power is back. And as you alluded, we read newspaper stories about states preparing for war, or at least planning for war if it is to come. Is there a particular historical moment, perhaps a warning from the past, that you would urge we should study today?
Well, not just because I study it, and it's a very good question, not just because I study it, but I think the period before the First World War has some very instructive parallels. The great powers were increasingly apprehensive of each other. And in the 10 years or so immediately before the First World War, there was an arms race. And the danger about arms race is someone is always going to be in a good position to fight and afraid of falling behind. And so, for example, you got the Germans very concerned that the French were increasing the size of their army, introducing a better field gun, a more mobile and more accurate field artillery. They were also very concerned that the Russians were redoing their army after their defeat against Japan in 1904, 1905, and were improving enormously their railway network, which of course is very important for moving all those big armies around. And in 1914, you had people in the German high command saying, if we don't fight the Russians and the French now, we won't be able to do it in 3 years. And that's one of the dangers of an arms race is, you may be in peak position at a certain moment, but you're going to fall behind because someone else is going to leapfrog over you. And I think one of the dangers also before 1914 is that you got too many people thinking that war was inevitable. And so there was an important sort of psychological barrier that was passed. And it was partly because in the mood of the times, there was this interest in Darwin's theories and an argument, wrongly, I think, that Darwin's idea of evolution and the survival of the fittest could be applied to human societies as much as it could be applied to species. And so you got people, prominent statesmen, that's what was worrying. The Austrian chief of staff, for example, was a social Darwinist. The prime minister or the chancellor of Germany was a social Darwinist. And what they said is, war is inevitable. It's something that happens, and a nation that's not prepared to fight deserves to die. And if you get people thinking like that, you begin to understand that they see war as something that might have to happen. And I think they almost begin to accept it psychologically. The other dangerous thing, I could go on, but I will stop. The other dangerous thing about the thinking and planning before the First World War is all the major powers, with the exception of Britain, which didn't have proper war plans at all. It hadn't quite decided what it was going to do. But the major continental powers only had offensive war plans. They had stopped updating their defensive plans. They had effectively abandoned them, in other words. And so they were waiting for a cause for war. But once that cause came, their plans demanded they get out there quickly and they strike first. And so I think the pressures were very dangerous. And that's what I mean by the dangers we have today of an arms race. The Chinese have just tested, they're just deploying new warships which don't have any crews on them, which are worrying, but they've also just tested a supersonic cruise sort of missile into space, which is very, very difficult to detect. And the Americans are very concerned about this and worried about falling behind. So you get this tension and fear of falling behind, and then you will get the argument, we better fight now rather than later. I'm not saying anyone's going to start a war, but it's a more volatile situation.
This next question comes back to your concluding thought about the unintended benefits, unintended consequences of war. If war is a catalyst for meaningful change within a society, which can be positive change, should we embrace it or dare, the question asker says, even encourage and accept it?
Well, no, I don't think we should. And I think that would lead us down a very dangerous path indeed, but it's a provocative question. You certainly had people before the First World War, and indeed you had people before the Second World War, including Hitler himself, saying war is very good. It shows the mettle of the nation. It brings out the best in it. The professor of war studies at Oxford used to talk about a healthy bloodletting. Of course, he was safely beyond military age, so it wouldn't be his blood that was going to be shed. But no, I don't think we should embrace war for that reason. But it does seem to be something in human nature that it often will take a crisis to focus our attention. I mean, I think we knew, and I think COVID is a very interesting sort of example. We knew before COVID, or people were warning that supply lines were a bit fragile, warning that you shouldn't depend on offshore production for everything, that you might want to decide that certain things were strategic goods that you might want to produce in your own country or have produced nearby. And I think we were also aware of some of the inequalities in society. And I think what the COVID pandemic is highlights some of those. And I think we've taken steps that would have been unthinkable without the pandemic. Government spending money to prop up the employment of the poorest members of society or to support medical research on the scale which they're supporting it, I think really we wouldn't have done without the COVID pandemic. So I think sometimes it takes a great crisis, and I'm hoping the climate crisis will do the same. But I don't know. I don't think we should ever embrace war because, as I say, you never know where it's going to go.
You've anticipated some of the questions. COVID has come up in the Q&A quite a bit here. We often use the word war to talk about meeting major challenges, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. We've talked about the war on drugs. Are we at war against COVID? Should there be a war against climate change? How does that thinking benefit or restrict how we solve crises?
Yeah. I think it can be a trap in a way. I mean, I tend to take a very narrow view of war, that it is organized violence committed by an organized group against another organized group. And I think we use war perhaps too easily as a metaphor. I mean, a war on drugs, a war on obesity, which Boris Johnson announced in the UK a few months ago, a war on this, a war on that. And you know, sometimes it reaches absurd level when you had President Trump, for example, saying in the early stages of COVID, I consider myself a war president. So I think, you know, the metaphor can be overused. And I think war should be something that we look at as a very particular phenomenon, which doesn't mean that there are not things that resemble aspects of war in the way in which we have to respond to things. I mean, responding to a major crisis demands leadership, which you want in war, demands a mobilization of society's resources, which you also want in a war. But I would myself prefer to see war describing this very particular type of activity.
This next question is short, but a powerful one, I think. What is the alternative to war?
Well, we've been looking at it, of course, for centuries and millennia. And the alternative is that we cooperate better with each other. And we have examples of regional cooperation in the past where people in a particular region have seen that it is actually in their interest to get on rather than continue to fight with each other. And so we certainly know that in a region we can have cooperation. Now, sometimes that cooperation can be enforced. The Roman Empire didn't consult the people who came into the Roman Empire, but it provided actually a long period of peace and stability around the Mediterranean. Empire, I think, has often been a form of what has often served to provide stability. You don't have to approve or disapprove of empire, but peoples who have lived in empires have often had more stable and longer lives than people who have lived in more anarchic societies. And people were moving into the Roman Empire in its heyday. They weren't moving out, and because they saw an advantage in living there. But we've also tried for cooperation. I mean, the church in Europe, when there was only a single church in most of Western Europe, tried to impose a peace, tried to get the quarreling noblemen and monarchs to agree with each other, tried to declare that certain days there should be no fighting on. Peoples were told not to fight on holy days or they'd be excommunicated. And so there have been attempts, both through empire but through other kinds of cooperation. And I would argue the Concert of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, where the five great powers came together to maintain peace and stability quite successfully for the first half of the 19th century, was another example. And then we've seen, of course, the League of Nations and the United Nations. But I think as we become more globally interconnected, our sense of where we need to cooperate has expanded, so that you can't just have cooperation within a region, although that still can work. I mean, I think the European Union is a very successful example of how formerly fighting and quarreling nations can actually work together for a common good. But I think we're now much more aware that it has to really be global because our problems are global and because we are also interconnected. So I don't abandon all hope. I mean, I think there's a long and very complicated and often very honorable tradition of trying to manage war, trying to abolish war, trying to keep it under control and trying to prevent it. And I think that goes on.
Is it your sense that the increased dependence of major world economies each other, our globalized world, has that mitigated the risk of another world war?
I'd like to think so, but I don't think I can. The other great globalized period in modern history was before the First World War, when the movement of trade, people's investment around the world was, you know, on a par in some ways with what's happened to us. I mean, it was a very globalized age indeed. And arguments were made at the time by a number of prominent thinkers that there is no way in which the developed nations of the world are going to fight each other now because they'd all lose. It would make no sense, said one writer, an English journalist called Norman Angell. It would make no sense for Germany to take over Belgium because in the old days, you know, they could plunder Belgium, they could carry away its gold and silver, But what Germany really needs from Belgium in the modern world is the products of Belgian factories and mines. And if it takes over Belgium, it probably will get less of those than if it simply trades with Belgium. And so there's no way, said Norman Angell, that it would make any sense for Germany to wage war on its neighbors, or any European country to wage war on its neighbors. And so, no, there was a very strong idea that being linked by trade will make it impossible to fight, and you won't want to. Germany and Britain were each other's greatest trading partners before the First World War. It didn't stop them going to war with each other. And so I think the fact that the United States and China are each other's great trading partners, not greatest, but great trading partners, is not going to stop them from necessarily getting into conflict with each other.
Styles of warfare have reflected cultures and societies at large. I think you made that point really effectively, but you've also written powerfully about individuals. So what responsibility do individual leaders bear in the great wars of the past?
I think often a lot. Of course, it depends what it is they control. I mean, you know, if Napoleon had remained on Corsica and not had the opportunities he had through the French Revolution to rise up and become ruler of France, if he'd remained on Corsica, he might have been a very effective local brigand. He probably could have made life miserable for most of the Corsicans, but he wouldn't have had the impact he had. And so it depends what it is that a particular leader is capable or has the good fortune to control. But my own view is that often it makes a difference. I mean, I think the view that the single dominant general will win a battle or not overlooks the importance of logistics, of planning, of the types of officers he or she, usually he, has underneath him. But I think we can say that there are certain leaders who've made a huge, huge difference. Napoleon was one. I mean, I think if anyone else running France, when France was the dominant power in Europe, if it had been anyone else but Napoleon, that person would have accepted that France wasn't going to run the whole of Europe, that there was still going to be a Holy Roman Empire or an Austria-Hungary, there was still going to be a Britain, there was still going to be a Russia. But Napoleon, I think, was simply incapable of accepting there could be any other power that could challenge him. And I think the same thing was true of Hitler. Other leaders might have recognized that Germany was losing the Second World War and tried to get some decent terms out of the Allies. Hitler was prepared to destroy Germany and the German people rather than give up.
Your reference to the first US Civil War has got a lot of attention in the Q&A, and many people are asking about this. Would you be willing to offer a prognostication on the future of the United States, the likelihood of armed conflict there in the near future?
Well, I could do the usual historian's weasel trick and saying we don't do the future. But actually, I am concerned about the United States. I think the presence of the guns, the sheer number of guns that are circulating in the United States, but more than that, I think the appearance of armed militia. When you see groups of people in uniform marching, carrying weapons, that I think is worrying. Now, these may be just fringe, but I think a lot of people thought, the people, the Nazis, the SA and the people in brown shirts were just a fringe movement in Germany in the 1920s. And the polarization of American society, I think, is worrying. And the unwillingness to believe that the other side has any validity or has any reasonable viewpoint. There was a very alarming article in the New York Times about how there are a sort of group of sheriffs who I forget what they call themselves, the liberty defenders or something, who believe that they have the final word on what constitutes the law. They don't believe the law courts do. They don't believe in the structure of the law courts, and they don't believe in Congress. They believe that they are the guardians of the law in the United States. And there are a number of them, and they're in touch with each other. So, these may be fringe movements, but I find it concerning. That's all. I mean, I made a slightly silly remark when I said the Second Civil War, but it's impossible for me to rule out the possibility of armed conflict in the United States. I hope I'm wrong, but I find these signs worrying.
We have a few questions about democracies at war. In your research, do democracies fight differently? Are they motivated differently than totalitarian states?
Well, in a totalitarian state, you don't have a choice. If those in charge, whether that's Stalin or Mao or whoever, want to fight, then you don't have much choice about it. But even in totalitarian states, I think it really makes a difference whether there is popular support. I mean, what really, I think, saved the Soviet Union in the face of the German invasion, which I think, was extraordinary when you look at how far the German troops got into Russia and how close they came to taking Moscow. I mean, if you could hear in Moscow, you could hear the guns on the outskirts of Moscow. You think how close the Germans came to taking it. And I think what really saved Russia was the patriotism of the individual Soviet, of the Soviet people, the volunteers who turned up. And I think Stalin and the Communist Party recognized this because they dropped the appeals to communism and very much talked about Mother Russia. And suddenly the churches were reopened and the sort of Russian history was called into play. And when the Russians fought an unpopular war in Afghanistan, it was one of the things that helped to bring, when the Soviet Union rather, was one of the things that helped to bring the Soviet regime down eventually. But it's much more difficult in totalitarian regimes for people to express their opinions and to express their dissent. But democracies, I think, have a real problem in fighting wars that aren't popular, because sooner or later the public will make its views felt through letters to the newspapers, presently through social media, and of course in elections. And I think that's one of the reasons the United States was unable to sustain its war in Vietnam, because it simply became too unpopular with the American people. But when democracies are united, as they were in Britain during the Second World War, as they were in Canada, and as they were in the United States after Pearl Harbor, then they can be very formidable indeed, because they have a high degree of voluntary public support.
I have an interesting question here about whether or not the Geneva Conventions changed the face of war. And I think we could put this in a larger question. Over the long period of history that you studied, were laws of war abided by? Have they changed war? Can we police and legalize war in a sense?
Yeah. It's so odd, isn't it, to even talk of laws of war. We're talking about this act of violence, but in fact we have tried down through the centuries to develop laws and regulations. I mean, the Greeks, for example, didn't fight on certain festivals. They didn't fight during the Olympics, even if they were quite prepared to fight otherwise. And there were often conventions. The Greeks usually stopped fighting when the sun went down. And so in a curious way, there were conventions in war, and there were long-standing, and they varied over the centuries, views on how you treated civilians and when you sacked a city or not. The sooner a city surrendered to a siege, the better you treated it. There were sort of understandings about how you did this. And there were, attempts made to say that women and children and old people should be exempt from punishment in war. And then treating captives in war. I mean, there were a whole sort of set of protocols in various societies about how you treated those who'd been captured, and protocols about how you ransomed them. I mean, there was a chart, for example, developed, I think, by the French about how much you paid for a captain and how much you paid for a colonel and how much you paid for a general who'd been captured by the enemy. And so, there have been all these attempts. And the Geneva Conventions were an attempt in the middle of the 19th century to insist on treatment of those who were wounded in war and those who were captured in war. And I think very important, because it was one of the first multilateral agreements set up, as you know, by the Swiss after Henry Dumont, a Swiss businessman, stumbled across a battlefield and saw the horrors when no one was looking after those who lay wounded on the field except local people doing their best. And the International Committee of the Red Cross was established, and countries signed on to support it. And so it wasn't just a deal between two countries, it was really a genuine multilateral thing. And I think it did make a difference in the treatment of prisoners of war and in the treatment of civilians. But of course, what happens in a war is rules gets broken. And when you're fighting a war, particularly on the Eastern Front, where you think, as the Germans did, the enemy is racially inferior, then you don't obey the rules. And the Germans did not obey the rules. And the Soviets, in response, didn't often obey the rules either. And so, the rules can be made, but you have to have the willing participation of those who are actually fighting.
Cyber war is on our radar now and in the news now, the idea of cyber war. Does the idea of cyber war necessitate a change in how we think about war, or do the old principles still apply?
Well, I'm still still grappling with what cyber war actually means. If it means attacking the electronic systems, the computer systems that run your enemy's infrastructure, or make it impossible for your enemy to use his command and communication systems, then that is a type of war. But it isn't the direct application of force. It's a weapon that will prevent your enemy from using his full force. And so I suppose it's a branch of war, but I'm not sure I see it as a full-blown war in itself. But I think it's one of those things we need to think about. What I find more concerning is the use of artificial intelligence and automated self-directed weapon systems, which can make decisions for themselves, can change their course, can decide on their targets. And these are becoming increasingly sophisticated. And what I think is concerning is at what point do human beings say, no, you can't do that? Can we stop them? I mean, will they get out of control of any human decision making? And this is something that I think is deeply concerning.
I'm going to just combine two questions now that come from different perspectives, but work well together. One of our question askers is asking about the power of war to lead to war, the power of war to radicalize society and lead to future war. Others are asking about the power of war to show the horrors of war, to stop war. Does war beget war?
It depends, doesn't it? I think on the context and on the ways in which previous wars are used by elites for their own purposes. And I think, let me give you an example of Germany, because I think it's a very important one in the 20th century. At the end of the First World War, the German High Command and many of its supporters in the upper levels of the bureaucracy and the Foreign Service and so on argued that Germany had not lost the war, that German armies had remained triumphant and victorious, and that the war had only been lost because of the civilians at home who had stabbed Germany in the back. And those civilians, of course, were largely on the left, or so it was said, the socialists, the communists, and increasingly the Jews were picked out as well as contributing to Germany's defeat. And so you got in 1920s Germany a significant number of the German population who came to believe that the army remained above reproach, that it wasn't its plans, it wasn't its failures that had caused Germany to lose the war. It was the weakness of certain sections of the German population, or the malevolence of certain sections of the German population. And you got, in the Nazi Party, for example, and those who supported it and those who thought they could work with it, a view that war was actually a very good thing, that Germany would reassert itself through war. I mean, certainly Hitler, I think from very early on, wanted another war, was prepared to use war, was more than prepared to use war. I think he saw it as a positive good. And so in Germany, the First World War left a residue which helped to feed, in certain sections of the German population, this view that a new war would be good, and to approve of preparations for war and thinking about war. The absolute catastrophe of the Second World War for Germany and the German defeat, and the recognition that Germany had committed appalling crimes in the course of the Second World War, led, I think, to a revulsion against war in Germany, with the result that Germany and Germans have now become one of the most peaceable peoples in Europe. And so I think, as I said, it depends very much on the time. And there weren't those in Germany after the Second World War, if they were there, they didn't get a chance to do it, who glorified war and who said Germany needn't have lost, that Germany could have won. And there's a very interesting book by someone called Sheehan called Where Have All the Soldiers Gone? And he points to a real cultural change in Europe, that war is something that younger generations no longer regard with admiration. They regard it as something appalling and with horror. And so I think some wars will lead to future wars. And I think that often has to do with how elites in those countries use war and you know, the amount of popular support they can get. But some wars will lead to a very decided reaction against war. And I think that's what happened after the Second World War in Germany and much of the rest of Europe.
That was an outstanding series of answers. Thanks so much for engaging with all of those questions. We have even more questions, but we're running short of time. I want to thank you personally from the International Relations program here for reminding us just why the study of war, the study of the history of war, is so important. It's something we think about and is a major part of our curriculum. And I think you have explained why it's so important that we grapple with this history. On behalf of Provost Moran and all of us at Trinity College, we thank Professor MacMillan for being with us tonight and for giving us this incredible lecture. And we do very much look forward to when you can join us in person for a lecture on campus. Thank you, Margaret. I also want to thank our Trinity and U of T community of students, alumni, faculty, and staff who tuned in this evening. And we hope to see you all again soon too. And I'm going to leave the last words to Professor MacMillan.
Well, thank you, Professor Sale, or Tim, if I may call you that. And thanks to everyone from Trinity who organized this. Thanks to the Provost, thanks to Professor Boswell, thanks to the Trinity staff who organized it so well. And thanks to all of you for your terrific questions, and thanks for being so patient. And I hope we all do meet in person one day. Many thanks.